Guess it's about this time that they took us and put us in these internment camps.
Mm-hmm.
They called it internment camps, but it was a prison. Yeah, I guess America is sort of ashamed of.
Yeah.
They don't have anything written up. They don't even talk about it in school.
Yes.
Huh.
Early morning on December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in the wake of World War II. Within a day, the U.S. declared war on Japan, and anti-Japanese sentiment was on the rise. Pre-existing prejudice was already prevalent along the West Coast, as Japanese Americans were fairly successful in the agricultural business. In her book, Shu historically recalls that in the early 20th century, Japanese Americans were candidates for perfect citizens. Through this, the model minority myth came into play, as Japanese Americans were becoming more successful through business, agriculture, and high education attainment. They were taken as a threat by their white counterparts. Following the mass hysteria after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, even after the Munson Report was released, which specifically stated that, quote, "The Japanese are hampered as saboteurs because of their easily recognizable physical appearance. There is more danger from communists and people of the bridges type on the coast than there is from any Japanese," end quote. With prejudice and fear on the rise, Executive Order 9066 was justified as a military necessity, ordering any person of Japanese ancestry in the Pacific Military Zone to be moved to relocation centers inland. Because they weren't given much time, many Japanese Americans lost their property and were forced to sell their shops or possessions for very little. This left many of them full of resentment, such as my great-aunt Grace, who was only given 3 days to pack up anything she could, versus my great-aunt Dorothy, who had a few weeks to plan, due to living more inland. My great-aunt Dorothy was one of the lucky ones. She didn't lose her family farm, but she did recall on others who weren't so fortunate as her.
Some of the mothers, they had such nice dishes from Japan. They wouldn't hardly give them any money for it. She said, "I'd rather break." She'd slam it on the sidewalk. She said, "I'd rather break it to pieces rather than let them have nice Christian Mr. and Mrs. Beck. They saved our property, my brothers and ours, everything. And they charged rent
So
to
you made
these
money.
people, and they sent us the money.
Wow.
Yeah.
You really got lucky.
They were so
President
nice.
Roosevelt had claimed that the order was set in place to prevent espionage and to protect Japanese Americans from strong anti-Japanese attitudes, which could bring them harm. If Japanese Americans were being protected from anti-Japanese attitudes, then why were guns pointed inward on them? American soldiers were assigned to outposts to keep constant watch on internees. Jean Wakatsuzuki Houston's personal accounts of her internment in her book, Farewell to Manzanar, explained that every night the bright spotlights would scour the land, shining through every little hole in the brack walls as they slept. Barbed wire surrounded the Japanese Americans, and guns were constantly pointing on them. This wasn't protection from the outside. It was containment to the outside. Some made the most of being interned, knowing they couldn't do much about it. My Aunt Dorothy was younger, so being in camp gave her a sense of freedom. Being able to meet new people and to go to dances where she met her husband Jimmy, my grandfather's brother, was an escape from her previous life where she worked every day on her family farm.
In camp, we had a lot of fun. Yeah, it was, and our work wasn't very hard. We even working in the dental contagious disease, I just stayed there until my little nephew he
okay.
can go home. Yeah, because he was so sad.
So it was like a kind of like an escape from the farm. You could
Yeah, it was an escape from the farm, and it was fun because we met all these people. All the Japanese girls. Gee, there was in our little group. It was so nice. And Jimmy was there, and he was such a good dancer. Oh, he was fun to dance with.
My grandfather's sister, Grace, was a little older when interned, so she was affected differently. So I asked my father a couple of questions, as he lived with Grace for a while when he was a teenager.
Do you think some of the resentment Aunt Grace held was because of maybe where she was at the time when she was evacuated in her life?
Yeah, I think she may have resented the part, because she was going through high school. She had a different perspective than Aunt Dorothy. Aunt Dorothy was younger, but she basically didn't get that chance to go through high school as a teenager. She was interned, and she spent her life there during her teenage years.
Even though the Japanese Americans were provided education, jobs, and an ample amount of food in the camp, they were still being held there against their will. Out of the 117,000 interned, 2/3 were Nisei, second-generation Japanese being born in the U.S. Their basic rights of freedoms were stripped from them on the basis of their ethnicity. They were American just as much as any other. This was an act made upon prejudice and deep-rooted anti-Japanese sentiment on the West Coast, specifically the 1920 Alien Land Laws, which prohibited Issei, first-generation Japanese, from owning or renting agricultural land, even under American-born children. The bombing of Pearl Harbor opened way for these white farmers to take back agricultural land and property from Japanese Americans, as they once did in 1920. After the Japanese Americans were released in 1945, many of them couldn't return to the West Coast. They were still met with prejudice by former neighbors, and much of their property was either taken or vandalized. I asked my Aunt Dorothy if any time she faced this certain prejudice after she was released.
They lived near us, and they were real good friends of ours, my sister and I. But after the war broke out, some of the ignorant people, I would say, they got a little prejudiced and didn't want to associate with us anymore. But
still today, the internment of Japanese Americans is seen as a shameful part of American history. The U.S. had interned their own citizens based on their heritage. Those interned had family members fighting for our country, yet still here we were considering them as the enemy of our nation. This caused much resentment among many of the internees. My Aunt Grace never talked about internment, as she kept it a silence within our family.
So, you spent some time living with her. Did she ever mention the internment?
She very rarely spoke about internment. For some reason, that part of her life, she never wanted to share as much about it. In fact, my father was the same way. I didn't know anything about internment, even though he wasn't interned, because he went directly to World War II. He served in the Army or the 442nd. He basically was taken to Europe. And that's what
Eye-opening.
your grandfather, his dad, Francis, was in service fighting for this country, 442nd Regiment, yeah. And here they pick us up just because we have a Oriental face, and they put us in this place they call internment camp.
I was able to go to Manzanar in 2016 to visit, and I remember thinking, how can a nation who prides itself on freedom and opportunity lock up one of its own? So I hope that internment becomes taught more in schools throughout the future, because as much as we want to forget, we have to remember.